Welcome to the Clinical Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club. Here in our PCRF Journal Club, we promote evidence-based practices by critically evaluating the latest science in emergency medical services. We hope our discussion will help advance EMS practice. Through the generous support of our sponsors, Limmer Education and ESO, we are able to make science more accessible and understandable.
Welcome, everybody. This is an exciting special edition webinar, and we are so lucky to have a full house. This is a super awesome opportunity for a topic near and dear to my heart around diversity, equity, inclusion, and it is about the EMS workforce. We have with us the better part of the NAMSP, the National Association of EMS Physicians Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. This committee is now a standing committee, not just a task force, which is amazing and fun in and of itself, and has undertaken two very important and large projects to do a scoping review, which we'll discuss here in a minute, regarding the available literature around emergency medical services diversity, equity, inclusion, disparities, and care. So we're going to start today with EMS workforce, but this great committee with quite a few dedicated individuals has done two different scoping reviews, and we will have a follow-up special edition that will be on January 19th, Thursday, January 19th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central. So we will remind people of this towards the end of this particular broadcast. Now, the principal investigator is Dr. Jordan Rudman for this particular diversity, equity, and inclusion in the United States Emergency Medical Services Workforce Scoping Review, which was published, congratulations to the group, in and full disclosure, I did help just a tiny bit, so I have full conflict of interest. I declare it. I declare my love for all things diversity and all the people on this call, and therefore have complete and total bias. So having gotten that out of the way, I was working for super happy to say this published as an open source in PEC, so no one needs to be, it's not gated, it's just out in the wild, and we will give you the link to this in the chat. Now, Dr. Rudman's going to kind of just maybe begin. Should we do a few introductions? Let's get the all-star team to talk, and we'll do it in order of authors. So jump on in when it's your turn. But Jordan, do you want to just begin with your own introduction, and then we'll do Dr. Farkas and Dr. Salazar?
Sure, I'll share my screen so the author list is up there so people know what they have in the order.
Excellent.
All right, hold on.
Love it.
There we go. Okay. And let's see. All right. Yeah, thank you all for coming. My name is Jordan Rudman. I'm a emergency medicine resident in Boston at Beth Israel Deaconess, former EMT, and really privileged to work with so many amazing co-authors on this work.
Awesome. Dr. Farkas?
Hi, everyone. My name is Andra Farkas. I'm an assistant professor of emergency medicine at the University of Colorado at Anschutz campus, and I am also an EMS physician.
Dr. Salazar? Is Gil on, I think? All right. Dr. Crow?
Hi, everyone. I'm Remily Crow. I'm Director of Research at ESO, and I'm one of the hosts of the Clinical Journal Club podcast.
Awesome. And Kimberly.
Hi, everyone. Kimberly Witten-Chung. I'm the Director of EMS Education at Pikes Peak State College in Colorado Springs.
Awesome. Dr. Torres? Gil is on. He might have trouble unmuting. All right. We'll catch him on the flip side here. And I believe we're to Megan. Yep.
Hi, I'm Megan Von-Isenberg. I am a librarian at Duke University, and I worked on the paper from the perspective of the methodology of a scoping review.
Awesome. Dr. Hamid?
Hi, I am Amira Hamid. I'm an assistant professor of emergency medicine at the University of Chicago Medicine. I also serve as associate EMS medical director for Chicago South EMS, and it's great to be here with you all.
And Dr. Joyner?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Anjani Joyner. I'm an assistant professor of emergency medicine at Duke University and also serve as a medical director for Durham County EMS.
Awesome. We also have Dr. Owusu Ansah.
Hi, I'm Dr. Owusu Ansah, inaugural chair of the DEI committee of NAMSP and EMS medical director at UPMC Children's Hospital, Pittsburgh.
Awesome. And Dr. Fernandez joined us as well. Tony, are you there?
Hello, I'm Tony Fernandez. I am ISO's principal research scientist, and I'm also one of the weekly hosts of our podcast.
Fantastic.
All
right. Welcome, everyone. And when Gil gets, maybe he'll get to a quiet spot, he can introduce himself as he makes a comment. We want to start off just normally with what we ask all authors, which is, what made you want to study this? And so, Dr. Rudman, do you want to just start us off on why even do this? Like, what was the point? Why do this deep dive as to what the literature says?
Yeah, I think it's a great place to start. So I think that the first place we kind of started with this work was thinking about where EMS exists in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion right now. And the reason for that is multiple. I think everyone working on this project comes to the project with their own personal reasons for wanting to be involved in this work. For me, my interest in this topic really came from thinking about the different structures in healthcare and in health that affect our patients and affect our healthcare, our clinicians and personnel in healthcare. And one of the things that's most powerful to me about working on equity issues is that there are many things in medicine that we deal with on a daily basis, heart attack, stroke, cardiac arrest, all these things that just exist out in the world. We didn't create those things. And we do our very best to study them and learn how to take care of them and treat our patients, but we have limited control over those things, and they sort of exist with or without us. But a lot of the issues around health equity, health disparities, result directly from systems that we actually create and maintain ourselves, and that we actually have power over to change. And so I think that it's a place that to me feels very actionable, something that we can really do to help our colleagues and help our patients, to advocate for our colleagues and advocate for our patients, because we have the agency to actually make changes in this space in a way that is really fundamental.
Fantastic. I also missed a couple of our great committee members and participants and panelists. So Dr. Tripp, please quick introduce yourself. And we also need Dr. Pereira.
No problem. Thank you so much, David. My name is Dr. Ricky Tripp, and I'm an emergency medicine physician, EMS physician with faculty, and also the medical director for 4 different EMS agencies in the city of Pittsburgh for EMS. Thank you.
Awesome.
I'm Dr. Carolina Pereira. I am the Chief Medical Officer for Lee County EMS. Please excuse the digs. We're still working with the aftermath of Hurricane Ian, so forgive the maps.
Awesome. Sorry, often and awesome. You are often very awesome. Okay, so Jordan, take us through this. Let's just first go with, take it away. Walk us through this.
Yeah, Dave, you're sort of asking about and then what was the background for us coming to want to kind of study this question? I talked about, my own reasons for being interested in this, and I would love to hear kind of from other authors what their own reasons were for being interested in this. But I think the way we sort of came to this question was that there was already some great work done, particularly by Dr. Crow, who's on the call with us and who worked on the article with us, that has shown already that the demographics of the workforce don't represent the diversity of the U.S. population writ large, at a national scale. And so that was sort of the first fact we started from. And then thinking about, why study this? Why do we care about having a diverse workforce? Personally, I believe that aside from any benefit to our patients or the system, like people deserve to be able to have a career in EMS if they want to have a career in EMS, and that shouldn't be affected by, the color of your skin or the gender you identify as, or any of those things. And then once you get to EMS, you deserve to have an equitable experience, be that, your workforce experience, your pay, all of those things. So, but there are benefits to a diverse workforce that we know in the literature. So we know that, diverse workforces in healthcare result in improved access to care for marginalized communities. That means because clinicians from marginalized backgrounds tend to go and work in communities that are marginalized, that means that those communities tend to have improved access to care. Diverse workforces lead to improved treatment in terms of reducing healthcare disparities, hopefully, improve patient-clinician communication and patients' satisfaction. Obviously, patients are more satisfied when they feel like they're respected and they're sort of seen as their whole person, and that includes, some of the aspects of their identity that might be where they can be marginalized if they're not taken care of by clinicians who are like culturally competent and kind of understand their perspective. There are potential improvements to patient safety that probably result from like improved patient-clinician communication and also improved team dynamics. We know that diverse teams take more creative approaches to problem solving and result in better problem solving. That comes from like some of the organizational psychology literature. And so, in that we were sort of thinking about, I'll go back to the slide for 1 second. In that we were sort of thinking about, okay, so what is the current state of diversity in EMS? Yes, we know it doesn't reflect population diversity, but more specifically, like what do things look like right now? And then what do we know about the experience of clinicians who might be underrepresented in that big picture? What is their workplace experience like? And then from that, what are the issues that we might be able to find that we could actually act upon? And where are the gaps? Where do we need more information? So that sort of leads us to talking about doing a scoping review. And I'll let, Megan can jump in here and kind of talk a little bit about the differences between a systematic review and a scoping review. But the Joanna Briggs Institute had this two really nice quotes from this paper they put out about this difference. And forgive me for reading direct text from my slides. I hate doing that. But in this case, I thought these were great quotes. So the systematic review is really for like, if you have a precise question addressing feasibility, appropriateness, meaningfulness, or effectiveness of a particular treatment or practice, then a systematic review is a good approach to take. Whereas if you don't have a singular precise question and you're more interested in identifying certain characteristics or concepts and in mapping, reporting, discussing those characteristics or concepts, then that's what a scoping review is for.
Yeah, and I would just jump in and say those are really great quotes. And as a librarian, I work on a lot of different systematic reviews and scoping reviews. And both of them seem at the surface to be, like really closely related, and they are, because you're trying to find basically everything that's been written on a certain topic. But when you have a topic that's really broad, or you're really trying to uncover what's known about something, what do we already know about something? Where are the gaps? What is a sort of map of available evidence on this topic, then the scoping review really is better. And I think we're seeing a lot more scoping reviews now, because the systematic review method had been sort of adopted and applied in a number of different settings outside of really specific clinical interventions. And it's really hard. It doesn't work. It doesn't work as well. And the scoping review really is designed as a methodology to help us just uncover what is learned and what is known. And I have a little hand friend over here. Sorry, reaching out from the forest. School gets out early on
absolutely. It's time
on days right before the holidays.
It's
so
fun.
Yeah.
You know, I was going to ask you about this just because it's really. Have you seen systematic reviews being more kind of ranking a bit? So do you see the kind of ranking of the evidence, the strength of the evidence in a systematic review, and then that weighing and the process of ranking is a lot more complicated and has to do with, you know, numbers of patients, versus scoping can just kind of lead you wherever it leads you. Gray literature and media pieces can just kind of pop in, but you don't really need to describe how the strength of the science. Would you say that that's about right?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for filling in with that. That is such a critical difference. With a systematic review, your question is narrow enough that your literature should be homogeneous, and that you should be able to actually meta-analyze it, or, you know, do an analysis, a risk of bias analysis on what's there. Whereas in a scoping review, we're just trying to identify what is known. And you may sometimes find with a scoping review on more clinical topics that there could be, for example, a finding that's about, well, there's this many randomized controlled trials and this many cohort studies. They're not going to appraise those randomized controlled trials or cohort studies. They're not going to do a risk of bias analysis or pool the results together, but they're just going to point a direction to say, hey, the literature tells us what we know about this topic. It serves as, you know, a library of what's known. And if we see that there's, you know, certain kinds of studies and not certain kinds of studies, that gives us a direction where to go next. And one of the things that a scoping review really can do is identify those gaps in the literature. We may want to fill those gaps as a next step, right? Or we may want to say, hey, there's a whole lot in this one area and we could do a systematic review in this one area, but it's given us this big, broad picture of what's known from the research literature. And then, you know, in the case of this and of this article, a really extensive look at the gray literature as well, so that we're not overlooking the kinds of things that may not get automatically published in research journals.
Love it. And I think that's a big takeaway here, is that in the scoping review, you might discover that there are 50 articles on something. But in your experience, you know, how many articles does it take for you to think, oh, there's enough to do a systematic review? We will go through the results of this scoping review. We had, in some cases, found 5, 10 articles that touched on something, but maybe that wasn't their direct, you know, randomized controlled double-blinded trial, which is hard to do anyway with diversity. But how do you think that had we discovered 20, 10, is there a number? Is it more about the strength of those studies themselves, and you could do it with 2?
You know, you can always do all kinds of even metasyntheses of qualitative of work that is pulled together. But I would say what we're really looking for is enough, you know, like homogeneity among the literature to be able to synthesize it. So I've certainly seen systematic reviews of 3 articles, and I've seen systematic reviews of 40 articles. So it depends on how big your question is. It depends on how diverse the literature is in terms of whether or not it makes sense to try to combine it. So here we've given like a map, right, of what's known, and we're not trying to come up with a conclusion that's, I mean, a research agenda is a good conclusion, but we're not trying to say, and this is the final answer, you know, this drug works better than this other drug, like you could do with a systematic review.
And I went right away to numbers, but you're absolutely right about qualitative. So finding the, you know, and synthesizing the qualitative findings of 2 papers might lead us to really be able to ask further questions. Okay, all right. So sorry to dive into those methods. We love them. And for people who don't do much research, they might have wondered. I think Dr. Rudman and et al. Should be very proud of the fact that this is likely, I don't know if it's the first or the latest, but it is very rare to get a scoping review published in pre-hospital emergency care. And so as a top tier 1 journal in emergency medical services and emergency medicine, it is kind of a big deal to get to this point. So really, really big kudos to do that. It is not, scoping reviews have not been commonly published in PEC. So I know Dr. Joyner had a conversation with the lead editor to make sure that it was still going to be okay. Take it away, Dr. Rudman.
Thank you so much. That was great, guys. So the objectives for this review really were looking at underrepresented groups in the United States in EMS. We wanted to kind of identify, summarize, and contextualize within the larger cultural context and gray literature in terms of what was being discussed in like the EMS media in particular. What is known about the demographics, the recruitment and retention, promotion, compensation, training, and the workplace experience of anyone in those groups. And we were particularly in this review interested in looking at groups based on gender, based on race or ethnicity, and based on sexual orientation, although those are by no means the only groups that might experience differential or unequitable treatment within the EMS workplace. So methods, there is just like there is a systematic review framework in the PRISMA has a checklist to go through. There's also a scoping review checklist that we followed. We did prospectively register our study protocol, and then we searched many databases, or should I say Megan graciously gave her time to search many databases quite extensively for the traditional literature. We also utilize a lot of gray literature, as you pointed out, gray literature being the non-peer-reviewed literature. So in this case, for us, that meant looking at theses and dissertations, as well as just looking at what was out there on Google, regulatory websites, so things, government reports, for example, and then industry media sites, EMS One, GEMS, EMS World, kind of those op-eds, news articles, and things that were relevant to the question. We used citation trailing, meaning that we looked through the citations of papers we found to make sure we weren't missing other relevant articles. And then we used some systematic review software to have each abstract and full text sort of iteratively screened by 2 reviewers and then resolved disputes as needed. We extracted data using a standardized form and then qualitatively summarized the results sort of in keeping with that scoping review methodology. So here are our inclusion and exclusion criteria. I'll just briefly go through these. So obviously we're looking at EMS personnel, and we define that very broadly. Anyone from the very beginning of sort of the EMS contact being like telecommunicators or dispatchers, as they're more commonly referred to, or EMS students even, all the way up through EMTs, paramedics, any kind of advanced care personnel, EMS physicians. So really anyone involved in EMS care. We kind of talked about the question, and our sort of content requirement relates to that question, making sure that we're looking at groups based on gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and really any of those kind of phases of demographics or workplace experience. We really took any time in time period into consideration as well. We sort of arbitrarily chose 1960 since that's on the earlier side of when EMS systems were existent in the US. And as I said, we looked at both peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed literature. Of course, we excluded things that were not English or not set in the US. And then importantly, we excluded articles that were focused on what I would call like non-EMS workplace activities. In particular, that would be like firefighting, hazmat, things that fire departments do that are not the EMS side of things. Cool. So we'll get to some results here. And if any of my co-authors want to jump in at any point, please do. I can't see all of you right now, so if you just interrupt me, that will be perfectly all right. So I'll take you through this figure a little bit. Essentially, this is how we got down from the big pool of articles that Megan helped us collect to the final number of articles. And this particularly relates to the peer-reviewed articles. I'll briefly touch on some of the gray literature stuff as well, but this in particular is peer-reviewed articles and theses and dissertations. So you can see we started with about just over 5,000 items to screen after we deduplicated them, and excluded about 4,900 of those. So that left us with 246 abstracts to go through. We also found a couple of full text articles manually just in the course of our reading, and ended up from those from those 255 full texts we ended up screening, we included 87 of those. And you can see most of the ones we excluded were excluded just for not being relevant to the question. Some of them were excluded for not being in the US or not being among EMS populations. Like we got a lot of like emergency department studies and things in there. A couple excluded for other reasons. This is a huge table, and I apologize. So I'll just kind of take you through a couple of the key things here. You can see that up on the top left, most of our studies focused on kind of sex or gender comparisons. That was about 75%. And then about 48% focused on race or ethnicity comparisons. And very few, only 3 articles looked at sexual orientation. Of course, those are not mutually exclusive. So articles might have looked at gender and race, for example. The most predominant themes kind of revolved around workplace experience, especially things like stress, burnout, and job satisfaction. And that could be articles on workplace stress, PTSD, burnout or attrition, those kind of things. About 13% looked at workforce demographics. And then you go down, you can see the coming and going into the workforce, education, and such. A lot of the articles did actually focus on these results within their conclusion, like their main title or conclusion, or within their discussion. So they really did actually focus on these topics. It wasn't like just one line in the results section, although in like you can see in like 7 articles that was the case, where the relevant part of the article might have just been like one sentence. But most of these were actually like talking about them in the conclusion or the discussion. And a lot of them were published in the last 10 years. You can see somewhere around like 50% or even like 60% of the articles were published in the last 10 years. Most of these were cross-sectional studies, so most of them were surveys. Go ahead, Dave.
I think it's fascinating to think of kind of how far back do you go, right? And in some cases, we highlighted some work that was done in 1992, right? And then some pieces that were done very intentionally by the National Registry around success on the exam, that may be work that needs to be repeated in a more, sort of more recent context. But I do want to say it's a difficult kind of, where do you draw the line? And in a scoping review, this concept, and I really want to applaud you and the team for following all of the different paths that could be followed. In other words, don't just leave no stone unturned. Let's find what is known, so that we can then expose at least what we know to be true. And I like the way you organize the themes also. So just talking about the effects, the mental health effects, stress, burnout, but also just kind of touching on occupational injuries and the workplace incivility that we found in some of those articles was able to be included. I do want to say inclusion and exclusion criteria. Oftentimes you think, well, is this article really going to make it in? And I think the group really did a good job of saying every reviewer needs to be trained and decide and go through a calibration process, so that the articles that were included, everyone agreed were based on those. Because when you have 5,000 articles to sift through, or abstracts, it gets really tedious, right? That was really a hard part of this. I wonder if other co-authors want to comment on the difficulty of getting through that many and trying to have some inter-rater reliability around what gets included and what doesn't. Don't all speak up at once. I know Dr. Joyner had some, there you go.
I can speak to that.
Yeah.
So yes, it was definitely a tedious process, but I think in terms of going back to the methodology of the scoping review, we really tried to make this as rigorous as possible, and kind of tying in what Megan was speaking about earlier with the differences between a systematic and scoping review. I think there's this kind of unspoken sense from journals that maybe scoping reviews aren't quite as rigorous in their methodology as systematic reviews. And I think, that's why we have these checklists that we follow. That's why we register these trials or these reviews beforehand. And we tried to make this as reproducible as possible. So prior to reviewing any abstracts, we had all of the reviewers review a sample of, I think it was 20 abstracts that we had kind of screened beforehand and determined which of those abstracts met criteria and which ones didn't. So that way we were able to provide feedback if there was any disagreement between which ones to include and which ones to exclude, and therefore kind of level the playing field so that everybody came into the review with the same understanding of the inclusion and exclusion criteria.
Love it. Love it. I think that gives it academic rigor and reproducibility. And truly 5,122, that's a large number. I know we went through that chart really quick, but that's somebody's PhD right there. It's a lot of digging. And I also just wanted to touch on this Arxi-O'Malley framework. So instead of just inventing themes, there was a very systematic way of extracting themes. So I just wanted to highlight that. It's that, can you, if somebody else were to follow this recipe, these methods, could they come up with the same number? Could they come up with with more articles? Maybe, but this was an exhaustive search. Okay, keep going. Sorry.
No, it's great.
You're doing great.
The other thing I wanted to point out from this table here was, as we said, we don't do a formal quality assessment in the scoping review, but I think looking at study methodologies gives you at least some sense of kind of what sort of quality of evidence we're talking about. If you look down in the bottom left here, the study designs, about 80% of these were cross-sectional, meaning most of these were surveys, which makes sense. Like you're talking about workforce studies of the workforce, if you're looking at salaries, right, you're going to ask a sample of people or a population-wide sample in the case of like the National Registry, like, what are people making? And so most of these workforce kind of human resource related studies are going to be cross-sectional. Some cohort studies mixed in there. Obviously, you're not going to see like randomized controlled trials of some of these sort of very kind of numinous and very human-centric personnel topics. Right. So getting into some of the results here, and I'll sort of editorialize a little bit with my titles. So I'll provide some data and then I'll provide sort of my own commentary in the titles of the slides here. So EMS is mostly men. Looking back from 1999 to 2019 in NREMT data, and this was work done, a lot of this was done by Dr. Crow, so kudos to her. Percent female within the workforce, about a third of EMTs over the years, and slightly less, maybe a quarter or to slightly less than a third of paramedics, depending. And again, these values kind of range over time, and I'll talk about how this has sort of changed. And EMS is not just mostly men, but it's mostly white men. Because when we look at the percentage of non-white personnel, similarly looking at data from about 1999 to 2019 within the National Registry workforce, we see that in 1999, about 10% of EMTs were identified as non-white. And in more recent years, there's about 18%. With paramedics, the numbers are a lot smaller, but 8% in 1999, and you see it really didn't change much at all. Once you got to 2017 to 2019, just 3%, going from 8% to 11%. So why is EMS mostly white non-Hispanic men? Well, because that's who we've been recruiting. So if we look at work again done by Dr. Crow, looking from between 2008, we're comparing 2008 and 2017 in terms of the percentage of women that were among newly certified National Registry clinicians in those years. We see that in 2008, about 30% or 28% of EMTs identified as female, and that went to about 35% in 2017, whereas among paramedics, that number changed very little from 21% to 23%. And similarly, if we look at race and ethnicity, the story is similar. The numbers are actually a little bit more dismal here. 22% of EMTs in 2008 identified as non-white, and that went up 5% to 27% in 2017, and from 13% to 19% respectively for paramedics between those 2 years. Interestingly, Dr. Crow found that this was mostly an increase in Hispanic clinicians, and especially among female Hispanic clinicians, but the percentage of Black clinicians really didn't change at all over that period, and was very low for both EMTs and paramedics.
I think this is an amazing finding, you know, in terms of some people lump diversity into just this big, you know, kind of pile. And it's possible that we have pockets, right, of in parts of our country where we have large quantities of a certain type of individual. You would say an EMS workforce inside a Native American environment, where you're going to see a lot of Native American EMS providers in that service. That doesn't necessarily, like you think of the San Antonio Fire Department and think of the quantity of Hispanic paramedics that happen to be in San Antonio. Yay, right? Now, I do want to just kind of insert that when you think of, for example, I don't know, I live in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and over 50%, so I think it was 57% or right in that neighborhood of our population is non-Caucasian. And we have this, you know, 3%, 5% that is truly diverse. So you, I think, have to really look at your community and the providers that are in your community and think, does this represent the patients that we serve, right? I think it's not all, it's the same thing about equity. I once heard this explained, and it's repeatedly explained as just everybody, if everything was equal and everybody had the same size shoe, we would just give everybody a size 11, right? But it doesn't work, because that's just my shoe size, not everybody's shoe size. And so what is in your community is actually really, really important, what's going on in your community. All right.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
I think that gets at one of the limitations of, you know, we look at national data sets a lot because we have the National Registry, and that is a place that it's pretty easy, or relatively speaking, easier to get data from. But that doesn't address, you know, what does the local diversity look like, which is, I think, as you pointed out, certainly a much more of a sort of proximate and important factor.
And Jordan, one thing I want to highlight there that you brought up, but I think that this is a big deal with this study in general, is that it was a 10-year look at newly nationally certified EMS clinicians. And so what that's a proxy for is workforce pipeline. And so the fact that we didn't really see any change over a decade there means that, you know, without intentional and direct efforts, we're not going to see change in the true composition of the workforce anytime soon. And so that's why a lot of this great work that's going on, and you'll see examples of this throughout, where programs are able to recruit from within communities and have those services look like the community served. That's going to be really important to affect any change.
And I would also like to just point out that this is newly, just as Remley said, this is newly hired recruits, but it doesn't really speak to retention. And I know that you're going to speak on that later, but that's also really important to note that we're seeing less retention in non-white clinicians as well.
You read my mind. There we go. So exactly, that there is some data to suggest that women and non-white personnel might be disproportionately leaving EMS as well. This is from 2014 and looking at the comparison within the EMS workforce and the proportion that left EMS. So you can see that about 30% of the workforce identified as female, but about 40% of those exiting EMS identified as female versus 12% of the population who identified as a minority versus 19% of those who left EMS identifying as minority. So greater proportions of females and minorities leaving EMS in this in that year. Another finding from this study I thought was really interesting was that a greater proportion of minorities reported the intent to return to EMS compared to white non-Hispanics in a statistically significant way. And so for me, that was kind of a hopeful statistic coming out of this paper. And it really opens up some questions about what factors are pushing people away, and you know, why are people leaving with intent to return, and kind of where is the opportunity there to intervene in the workforce and provide people with ways to provide mechanisms to retain these clinicians in the workforce. Talking about the pipeline, though, it's when we think about who is coming into EMS, it's also important to think about who is teaching those new clinicians. And the data would suggest that most of our teachers are probably still non-Hispanic white men, although this data you can see is 10 or more years old. But in two different studies that were fairly large in 2011 and in the early 2000s, we saw that over 70% were men and over 90% were essentially white. And that goes for training officers and EMS educators. So kind of across two separate but related populations of educators, we see the same kind of demographics. Thinking about other barriers to entry as well, there is a suggestion in the literature that there may be some barriers inherent in the testing we do, although with the caveat that this data is from 2002, and so we really don't have more recent data to kind of speak to. But among all of the candidates who were attempting initial paramedic certification through the National Registry in 2002, this study actually found that men had a greater odds of passing versus women in a statistically significant way. So about a 30% increased odds of passing versus women, or stated another way, women were less likely to pass the exam. And Black trainees were less likely to pass the exam in a very stark way than white trainees. So like a 60% decreased odds of being able to passing that exam. And then interestingly, among EMT candidates in a couple of studies among EMT candidates who didn't pass their first attempt, who actually failed their first attempt, women were less likely to retest. So that sort of speaks to, again, factors that might be creating an association that's pushing women out of the workforce, or erecting barriers for non-white and non-men recruits to actually come into the workforce. Obviously, that doesn't speak to sort of what is that barrier. Obviously, there's a lot of research in educational theory about things like stereotype threat, that this data can't address that. But there are other things we know about that might be erecting barriers to creating a diverse workforce and might push people out of the workforce. And one of those things that we know exists is a gender pay gap in EMS. So if we look at data, most of this is from, again, the early 2000s. So to be fair, a bit out of date, but for EMT basics, the difference in salary between men and women were making anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 less than men. And if we look at paramedics, there's some different estimates in different studies, but the estimates are a little bit lower. In other words, a little bit smaller of a gender pay gap, anywhere in the 10,000 or 5,000 range. But I would argue that regardless, I mean, especially if you think about the kind of salaries we're talking about, even $5,000 a year less is really significant on an EMS worker salary.
I was surprised by this, actually. So in my pea brain, I'm thinking, gosh, doesn't everybody have just a regular pay scale and all the EMTs and paramedics just go on it and you just get paid by seniority? But this really highlights that other part of the diversity and access issue, which is we might see more diversity at lower ranks where salaries aren't really capable of sustaining a family. So this is not, these are not potentially jobs that people could keep for a very long time unless they combine them with firefighting, or they combine them with law enforcement, or they just move to a different part of the healthcare sector and can earn something that would sustain a family. But I was surprised at that disparity. I think of that, in the corporate boardroom kind of sense of some people pick who gets the bonus or how who advances. And it was, I don't know if any of the other authors and panelists saw that, but please remember, we've got the chat enabled so people can make comments, and the Q&A as well. So there's lots of places to interact with all these authors. So thanks, keep going.
Absolutely. And I was surprised by this too. I mean, we think of EMS as a sort of hierarchical field in which your level of experience really dictates like where you are in the hierarchy. And that you would think would lend itself to pay parity. And I think why it doesn't is a really interesting question. We also looked, as I said, a lot at occupational well-being. We had a lot of studies looking at various aspects of occupational well-being. And I think this was the place where we saw the most heterogeneity in the studies, all kinds of different studies, a lot of trying to compare apples and oranges, unfortunately. And I think if you look in our paper, we have a lot more detailed data and there's a lot of lessons to be learned there, but to kind of provide a really 10,000 foot view of this, we didn't really see consistent associations with gender or race and ethnicity with a lot of these occupational well-being factors like stress, burnout, or PTSD, suicidality, depression, anxiety, or substance use. I asterisk suicidality here because there was one article that I just wanted to kind of highlight that pointed out a statistic which was really shocking to me. This study looked at career prevalence of suicidal thoughts and behaviors among firefighters in a national sample in 2015. And this was one of the few studies that included a fair number of Indigenous personnel, which they defined as Native American or self-identified Native American or Alaskan Native personnel. 82 out of this, about 1,000. So approaching like a 10% prevalence, which is a lot more than many of these studies had in terms of representation of Indigenous personnel. And they found, some of the most shocking statistics for suicidality that I've seen. Looking at research, we're used to seeing odds ratios, in the single digits. And to see a confidence interval for an odds ratio that goes up to 137 with a fairly reasonable sample size, I think is shocking and should really make us concerned. So again, this survey looked at firefighters nationwide in 2015, and they looked at career prevalence of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And they found that for suicidal ideation, for having had plans for suicide during your career, having actually made suicide attempts, or having experienced non-suicidal self-injury, or what sometimes is called self-harm, Indigenous personnel were way, way more likely to have experienced these things. Of course, that doesn't take into account what the baseline prevalence is. So I don't know whether that is particularly an issue among Indigenous EMS personnel or among our Indigenous populations in general. However, either way, that doesn't make it any less of a problem. And I think any of us who have Indigenous personnel that we engage with in our systems, especially if we're leaders of EMS, in places where we have a large Indigenous population, should really think about that and be very concerned about that.
I think I also want to point out that you appropriately made the point in the paper repeatedly that there's just been very little done around gender identity and sexual orientation, and that those are role strains that have also impacted mental health. So we know very little about LGBTQ plus populations within the EMS workforce, and the work that Ginny Renkowitz did around these, the stressors and burnout really did highlight a very similar finding around this. So I just want to encourage any budding researchers out there to think, we've kind of ignored an entire workforce segment and have sort of pretended that it doesn't exist, that this culture isn't present within our culture. So
absolutely. And talking about workforce stressors, I think one place where we did have a significant amount of data, and data that is really concerning, and unfortunately, I think unsurprising to anyone who's worked in EMS, is that for women in EMS, being sexually harassed is not an uncommon experience. And in fact, I would call it a common experience. Looking at multiple studies, we see that a pretty high proportion of women in EMS reported sexual harassment in fairly sizable studies. Among women firefighters in 2017, it was about 22% reported sexual harassment, and a fifth reported some type of other threats or harassment. Interestingly, in that study, they didn't see an association with harassment and the estimated number of women in your department, which would sort of suggest that there's something a little bit more inherent to the culture. It's not just about hiring more women necessarily. And of course, as we might expect, people in this study who were harassed had an increased odds of negative psychiatric effects like suicidality, depression, anxiety, as I would if I was experiencing harassment at work. A pretty big study of women firefighters, mostly from the US, although there were a couple in there from Canada, had a higher prevalence, like 40% reported verbal harassment, and also about 40% reported what they called sexual advances, which I think is pretty similar to sexual harassment. And 5% reported assault, which might not seem like a big number until you think about how many fire departments there are. And in the US, if 5% of women firefighters are being assaulted at work, that is an enormous number. And again, obviously harassment was associated with increased negative psychiatric effects there. Among our own membership in NAEMSP, there was a great 2019 study by Dr. Statz that looked at a bunch of different metrics of people's experiences, of women's experiences in NAEMSP, and 7% said they had experienced a sexual assault at work during their careers. Of course, they didn't ask, who was perpetrating that assault. And I know for many like EM physicians, there's also, and for EMS personnel, there's always a risk of violence from patients. But I want to point out that a lot of these studies were specifically, especially the two on the left here among firefighters, were specifically looking at, what people had experienced from coworkers. Looking at older studies, there was a study we included from 1990 that might suggest the culture has improved slightly. If we're saying anywhere from 20 to 40% of women in firefighting are experiencing sexual harassment these days, I guess improvement from 60% is a positive step, but still, obviously not good at all. And I think this study was interesting, just that it highlighted, again, sort of that these are cultural factors, not just policy factors. So despite the fact that 84% of the departments employing women in the study had an official harassment or discrimination policy, 60% of the respondents were still reporting sexual harassment. And in most of those cases, departments didn't take any action to resolve those complaints. And this is actually a well-known problem. In contrast to some of these things, I think that have maybe not been as well publicized. This is actually known about by policymakers. There was a report from the U.S. Fire Administration in 2019 that really pointed this out. They had a whole chapter on sexual assault in the fire service. They said themselves that the fire service is a male-centric and hyper-masculine culture that requires women to navigate a hostile environment at varying degrees. And they concluded that the culture of the fire service needed to change to be more inclusive to women. And they did include some good recommendations in there about how to move toward a more inclusive and equitable and safer culture. And going along with some of these negative workplace experiences we've talked about, I also just want to talk about occupational violence briefly. I know we touched on sexual assault there. Obviously, there's other kinds of occupational violence that people can experience at work. And a couple studies suggest that women in EMS might be at an increased risk of experiencing occupational violence. One study looked at clinicians nationwide who had experienced a violence-related injury at work over a couple-year period as a cohort study. And women were about 40% of reported injuries there, but only about 33% of the workforce. So those authors asserted that women might be at higher risk of workplace violence in EMS. Another study did a little bit more of a statistically rigorous methodology and actually did a regression there and found that women had an increased odds of about 30% for workplace violence in the past 12 months. And then I'd just like to highlight some things we don't really know much about at all. As you might have noticed, other than the data on sort of recruitment and demographics, we really don't know much about workplace experience of non-white clinicians in EMS at all. There's not a lot written about it. There's also no data on their workplace experience when it comes to racist harassment or violence. I know we haven't touched too much on the gray literature, And I would really encourage folks to kind of go look in the paper where we talk a lot about what we saw in the gray literature, especially those like media articles from EMS 1 and GEMS and EMS World. But one of the things that came up again and again was news articles about, a racist incident in EMS agency, a racist incident against a firefighter. These things came up over and over. And the fact that there's a lot in the sort of cultural zeitgeist about racist harassment in EMS and fire departments, but really no data on it, I think points to a major gap in our understanding of workforce experience. And as Dave rightly pointed out, there's also really no data on LGBTQI clinicians in EMS at all. And we know that this is a population that is likely to face differential workforce stressors. So I'd just like to wrap up with a little summary, and if anyone kind of wants to jump in, please do. But things we talked about. So we kind of once we went through all this data, of which I've just shared a small portion, we really organized our discussion into looking at the demographics as it currently stand, and then thinking about recruitment, getting people into the workforce, and how do we keep them in the workforce and retain them. So in terms of demographics, as we've pointed out, women and non-white personnel are still represented in EMS, and that's across levels from EMTs to EMS physicians. And we really have no idea about the demographics of the proportion of LGBTQI personnel in EMS or much else about that population in EMS. We know that recruitment has gotten a little bit better among women and Hispanic EMTs, but that recruitment of Black clinicians is lagging and hasn't changed very much over the last 10 years. And we know that some reasons potentially affecting that are there's a lack of representation, probably. And so if you see no one who looks like you in EMS, it's understandable why you might not choose to pursue that career. And there may be some barriers in testing. There have been a couple high-profile lawsuits in fire departments of alleging sort of differential treatment of recruits with regard to race or gender when it comes to pre-hiring testing. And I think there's a hint of that in the literature we reviewed.
I just want to highlight something that it's in the paper that just makes that point really, really well. And it's I think around page 2 in a 2020 study for male African American and Latino paramedics and paramedic students. The need for external sources of information about the profession, ongoing support for their interests from mentors and family, and external validation of their career choice. So not just, of course, when they arrive into the workforce, that's an entire other barrier and systematic way in which we exclude people or either marginalize them or don't really receive them well. But throughout the educational process, like you just said, if you don't see others who look like you, who want to support you, then it's really tough, and you just kind of go look around and go, am I really the only one? I think that's a big highlight and a takeaway from these particular papers. I also want to just shamelessly have to admit that we've already gone for an hour. And as we wind the results part down, I'm going to ask all of the authors to jump in and really kind of give us their takeaways. Like, where do we go from this, and how do we process this information? We've talked about next steps with other types of systematic reviews or studies that are particularly about some populations or some types of services, like Dr. Joyner said here, the studies around the fire service. But how do we, what takeaways you've read a lot of this, all of you authors, and that was a lot of reading to do, a lot of processing. You've clearly thought about it. Where are you with what happens next, and how do we get there? So don't be afraid to jump in as Dr. Rudman kind of brings it to a finish.
Yeah, I know we're running a little short on time, so I'll skip ahead, and people can review our paper for some of these things. But Obviously, where there are some limitations, you can read the paper. We talked about the limitations of scoping reviews. A couple of the knowledge gaps we identified were just kind of knowing what recruitment and retention programs actually work. There's really no data on that. We don't know what the demographics of EMS leadership look like. And again, we don't know much about LGBTQI clinicians. So in terms of just we did close our paper with some recommendations, and these were sort of drawn from, I won't claim to be an expert myself, so this is not my expert opinion, but the opinions of many of my expert co-authors. And so I'll let them kind of jump in here. But I think really EMS entities should be asking themselves if their workforce represents the community and really take steps to rectify it if it doesn't. I also think that high-performing EMS entities should be reviewing their compensation. We know there's a gender pay gap. We have really robust data to support that. And so you should look at your own agency and see, do you have a gender or racial pay gap? Because if you do, I think some people deserve raises. And look at your benefits as well. If you don't offer parental leave, that presents a barrier to people who can have children and might push people out of the workforce or prevent people from entering the workforce in the first place. And then lastly, let's think about leadership. How are people promoted into leadership? There's a lot of articles, media articles out there in the gray literature about, this is the first woman to lead this department. This is the first, whomever in this position. And that would suggest that our leadership is not diverse, even though we don't have formal data on that. And so how do you promote people to leadership? Do you have a transparent process for that? Is it equitable? And do your leaders reflect your community? And if your leaders clearly don't reflect your community, why is that? And then lastly, we should really be intentionally developing a culture, not just to deal with harassment when it occurs, but really to prevent harassment and discrimination. And that means you have to have non-retaliatory and non-punitive reporting. And then you have to do something with those reports to actually work to improve the culture. And one thing we hypothesized through this is that, perhaps if you recruit underrepresented clinicians into leadership, that can help improve the culture from top down. So I really appreciate your time. I'm sorry we're running a little short on time. I did throw in a few QR codes here that you can check out our article, companion article we'll be discussing in next month, and on disparities in EMS care, as well as a link to our DEI committee's site.
Awesome. Please leave those up for a little bit so people can snap pictures and grab them while we just begin to wind down here. Kimberly, what do you think about this in terms of EMS education? We have educators. John Mack is on here, Heather Davis. We've got some folks that do quite a bit of education. How does this hit your practice in Colorado? Do you think there's something to do there?
Sure, and I'm sure that I am preaching to the choir here. But obviously this starts in the classroom, right? We have to start changing culture in the classroom, and it's important for us to start integrating the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our own students, and recognizing that that we integrate the culture and respect for other cultures, respect for all people within the classrooms, not to mention recruiting other than outside of just the predominant culture, and recognizing that better patient outcomes, better patient care is recognized when we have representation from all cultures.
Okay, I'm muting and unmuting myself, and I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. Love the comment. Dr. Farkas.
Sorry, I realized I was muted. So I would say that if there's any EMS systems out there that are making strides in this area and are making changes to their systems, or looking at this closely, et cetera, it's really helpful to try to publish these findings and try to publicize them so that maybe other systems can kind of follow suit. Obviously, one EMS system, one EMS system, but that kind of information is obviously very valuable.
Absolutely. Love it. Dr. Usuansa is making sure we mention the IDEA project from the National Registry. Dr. Hamid?
Yeah, so just being on the DEI committee for NEMSP, one of the main reasons, like Jordan mentioned, that we started this research was because we're all interested in research. But the question was, as we went around that committee, that virtual table, and asked, well, what is it that you want to look up? What is it that you want to research? We all knew about these articles here or a sprinkle of articles there that showed this thing or that thing. But really the question was, what's already out there and where are the gaps? And what's like the overarching theme of all of the data that's already been published? What's going on in EMS? So that was like kind of the nidus to create this scoping review. And I feel like, it's done, it's out there. And I hope that other EMS professionals read this, really read it and figure out what are the barriers to attracting diversity? What are the barriers that make diversity leave EMS systems? And really try to create initiatives to address those barriers. So I would say that's basically my takeaway.
I love it. I love it. So many times you hear, especially in the context of medical circles that want to say, well, there's no evidence for that, or where's the evidence? And I feel like this committee set out to say, well, here's the evidence. And there are gaps, and those are the gaps that we should focus on. But let's not say that this was just invented, like it's not really a thing. We don't know it's a thing. We know it's a thing. We know it's a problem. So where do we go from here? I was teasing Dr. Crow here privately, sending her messages. How does it feel when somebody presents your work years after you were already saying this? Like this has already, been known. Remley, do you have some takeaways here from this scoping review?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this was a huge effort, and the kudos really go to this team. For me, the key takeaways are one thing that Dr. Hamid already said, which is when we're starting to do this kind of work, and Dr. Farkas too said this, that sharing the findings are critical. So that we can learn best practices and not just talk about what's not going well, but when we find something that is going well, using that to move things forward. And the other thing that I'll say is that, we've had a really great, rich discussion in this chat, but I think we find, when we go outside, we often are met with a lot of resistance and a lot of this pushback. And it's important for us to put this message out there that this isn't a zero-sum game. And for anybody looking for a reading list, check out The Sum of Us. It's a really great book. And this talks about what's good for the group that's being marginalized is often good for the many as well. And so it's not that you take away something from somebody else. This is actually something that adds to the pool. So I would just encourage us to continue this discussion and continue this conversation, even when it gets uncomfortable with others who may be pushing back.
Ooh, nice. That's a good one. That's a really good takeaway. Parting words, Dr. Tripp. I know you've been working hard at this. Dr. Joyner. Oh, she came on camera and then she left.
I was going to give Dr. Tripp a chance, but I'll jump in real quickly. So I think one of the things that you mentioned, David, was yes, we have a problem. And I think that the scoping review does a really great job in highlighting that. But I do think that there's a silver lining in all of this as well, because even just looking at the number of articles published over the last, 5 decades, I guess, that we included in this review, you can just see that the last 2 decades just showed an exponential increase in the number of articles published on this specific topic. And to me, that's really heartening, because it's showing that our field is moving forward and that we're taking this as a problem more seriously. And so the next step is just to continue kind of focusing on some of the gaps that we've identified here and adding more evidence and hopefully actionable processes and recommendations from our research that can improve diversity in EMS overall.
strong. Good. Dr. Tripp.
No problem. I just wanted to say, kudos again to everyone that was involved with this collaborative and the scoping review. And I would say, when Sylvia and I, were talking to each other about, the formation of the DEI, a task force, then into a committee, and seeing the overwhelming response of people, really united with this mission. And I would say, and definitely, Sylvia can speak, for herself, but as a Black female, I was being an EMS medical director and being one of the only ones in the room, a lot of these different things that I have experienced personally, and wanted to make sure that this was now put onto the agenda. So I will say that it's great now, because when you are in these different spaces, that this helps to unify and amplify the evidence when you are making change, and especially to quell down those that are non-believers, because now you have that evidence back. And that's also helpful for now funding, because I realize when it comes to funding and getting resources, people, that's the first thing they ask is, so can you please identify the problem? What are the research with it? And this is great to have that. So now we can go back to the table, involve our community members, and our neighborhoods, and to really boosting up the supply when it comes to, recognizing EMS as a profession that is achievable for many communities, and providing the resources so they can get into this profession and stay into the profession. Thank you.
So well said. I think we have to, that's the nutshell end moment. That is the audio caption that is that we want to have be the essence of the remainder of this. I apologize, we went a little bit over. I don't apologize. This is such an important topic, and you can't cover it in an hour, and a scoping review is so deep. We're going to put this QR code on the poster for the NM. Save the date. We have done a second special edition journal club that is just focused on disparities. So let's talk about sex and race and how equitable our care is in EMS on Thursday, January 19th, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central. We are, I hope you will join us for the anti-racism pre-conference workshop. There's still space available. Operators are standing by. You can register here January 2023 for the pre-con workshop. I see very wonderful and influential people on this call, which they're great friends from many years. So I want you to tweet this out. We've recorded it, and we're going to make it available on YouTube as well. So there's an entire DEI track in the NAMSP conference in January, at the end of January in Tampa. And it is extremely rich and deep, not the least of which will be having John Moon, original Freedom House member. How long will we be able to say that the 1967, 69 original Freedom House members are going to be present at a conference? It just doesn't happen. It won't happen going forward. So there's just lots of great stuff happening around DEI in Tampa. Posters and scoping reviews included. So please tune in January 19th, 2 p.m. Eastern. If you go to prehospitalcare.org or any of the links that we shared, that is how we're going to be able to connect you to some of these other resources. And of course, we will continue to collaborate with the Idea for EMS project. Thank you to Dr. Davis and the National Registry for helping disseminate this particular one. And we will need your assistance on the next one too, please. And finally, and without further ado, we will bring this to a close with our dear Dr. Crow giving us the bumper that we need to end the session. And I hope to see you soon in January online and in Tampa. Please continue to do good work. We need your advocacy for diversity, equity, inclusion. Thank you.
We hope you have enjoyed and learned from this PCRF Journal Club. Please share it with other interested EMS professionals. An archive of past journal clubs can be found at pcrfpodcasts.org. You can also find us on Facebook at PCRF at UCLA and on our website, prehospitalcare.org. A special thank you to our sponsors, Limmer Education, providing educational tools for success at every stage of your EMS journey, and ESO, dedicated to improving community health and safety through the power of data.